So I will hopefully stay on time. I'm going to talk really about two topics, both dear to my heart. One is EBI, and the other one is GA4GH. So just briefly, for those people who don't know about EBI, we're Europe's home for biological data services research. We do big data. We're part of EMBL, which is an intergovernmental research organization, which is European, but not directly linked to an EU treaty. So despite the fact that EBI is in the UK, we will be a little part of Europe that will resist Boris Johnson's wildest.
Will there be border control?
There could be. No, there won't be border control. Yes, is the answer. And what EBI has done for a very, very long time is handle this business of this mass observation. A lot of biology is about very, very large-scale observation. We take those observations, we derive insights, but we also provide those observations for other people to use. We're very close to astronomy in our need for ground truth observation of the stuff around us, and we are the clearing shop for that ground truth observation. You'll be delighted to hear I'm not going to talk about each one of these databases, which is one set of observations around one set of biology. I just want to pick out the areas that I think are the most important for this community. So one is led by the wonderful Helen Parkinson, who's chairing this session along with other things that she does for the EBI, and that is the GWAS catalog maintained between EBI and NHGRI. And just to mention that we have slowly built up both the kind of table 1 view of human genetics from Nature Genetics papers, which is the top loci, to also include now extensive summary statistics. I encourage all of you to submit your summary statistics to GWAS catalog, but also when you're reviewers to say, please submit your summary statistics to GWAS catalogs. I think as a community we do much, much better when that happens. And so this is a big collection of things across the world in different genetic cohorts that can be used for downstream use, and many people use it as a backbone of their analysis. Another aspect which I won't go into any depth with, but just to mention, the European side of controlled access data is very well handled by Thomas Keane and the European Genome Phenome Archive. This is a joint project between EBI and the CRG in Barcelona, so it's truly European. And Thomas Keane has been embracing GA4GH standards, which I'll come on to in a moment. So this means our controlled access system is making itself ready for the future by involving itself in this GA4GH project. And the final resource I wanted to mention is this public-private partnership called Open Targets. This is led by Ian Dunham. This has two academic institutes, the Wellcome Sanger Institute and EBI, together with five other companies, GSK, Takeda, Sanofi, Celgene, and Biogen. And it's really a great example of how both pharma and academia can really push forward the platforms needed to transform early stage drug discovery. Again, you could give an entire talk about this. I just want to emphasize that it's both a data generation platform and an informatics platform. Focused on that, the informatics platform sits on top of the data that is produced by EBI. And if you haven't gone to genetics.opentargets.org, if you're a geneticist, I really think Ian and his team has got one of the best interfaces for modern looking at summary statistics and looking at the breadth of genetics. So that was a whistle-stop tour through some parts of EBI that I think will be very useful for ICDA in the future. I just want to switch gears to GA4GH, the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. So some of you have seen this intro set of slides, but I think it's worth talking through again. So we are going through a very, very big shift in our science because our science has become properly useful for medicine. It always was useful at some level. It was always used in some aspects of science, but it's become broader and broader in its utility. But there is a big difference between research and medicine, and actually it's easier to understand that difference when you're not in an English-speaking country. When you're in an English-speaking country, people have to decide when to switch from their native language, which they do their medicine, to English, where they do international research. I'm extremely lucky that my native language is the same language as the international language of science. That indicator variable is one indicator variable to many, many other differences between doing research and practicing medicine. Medicine is going to sequence many, many genomes over the next decade. That's incredibly clear due to the large number of projects that are in progress around the world. And it's a great boon for research to think about using that for research. So this, if you're an epidemiologist, is very obvious. We are doing secondary use of healthcare data, in this case genomics, to help improve or to do research. But the numbers here are really quite large. But this comes with a change in access process. So for non-human data, we've always done what's on the left-hand side. We've insisted, in fact, on publication that people deposit data, which we then aggregate in a few number of places around the world, and people download this. So here, a researcher from Brazil picked up perhaps a whole bunch of protein structures that have been deposited over the last 30 years across the world. These days, or 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we added a second component here, which we'll call managed access. This is dbGaP and EGA, where people had to apply for access. They were allowed to download data sets, but then they could integrate those data sets locally if they had permission to do so. And this is one of the major ways people handle human data at the moment. But in the future, as I mentioned, there's an increasing number of places where you will not be allowed to download the raw data, and instead you have to send your analysis components into virtual machines. This is the way Genomics England's work. This is the way the Danish cohorts work under Soren, and many other places are following this model. It is slightly irritating, perhaps, for a researcher, but it's actually doable. It's probably the key thing to realize for all of its irritation. We understand, by the way, what I'm putting up here is a rough idea of the ratio of utility of access between these different methods. People, when you can fully aggregate and download, you get much, much higher usage of that data than when you have to go through these steps to get access. Actually, UK Biobank really does, I think, show what is the maximal ability to do that. We don't really know the ratio of this for the last case, but in some ways it really is going to be less than the middle. Nevertheless, it's going to be big. But to imagine this future, we do need standards. So these are technical standards to allow the virtual machines that we set up for Genomics England to work easily on the virtual machines in Denmark, and to make this federated data access work. And this is why I became chair of the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, and why this organization is set up. It is to be like the W3C consortium for the web, but for genomics. It is a global standard-setting organization that does not enforce how you implement things, but provides standards that people can comply to interoperate between data sets. So this is our mission. It's standards-based federated genomic data sharing. So just go through this in kind of the future that we want to create. So here's a researcher at Sanger. As people noted, I'm not quite sure why she has a white coat on, but maybe she's a clinician PhD. She has developed a WYSI neuroanalysis method, but she's realized that she really needs to run it over 100 million ascertained genomes. In 2022, Sanger will only have 1 million ascertained genomes locally, and so she realizes that she needs to go further than what she can do locally from Sanger. So using GF or GH protocols, I'm going to not say, I could say this was one click away. I'm going to be more realistic. I'm going to say it's going to take 2 weeks to port the virtual machine that is running on Sanger to each of these 4 other locations, one in the US, one in the UK, one in France, one in Denmark. She sends the virtual machines over to these different locations, and then she brings the results back to analyze. She derives a new target for drug development and cures cancer, and therefore satisfies her funder's grant. This actually is very close to working now. This looks like a bit of a fantasy, but it's not really. You can upload a virtual machine into Genomics England that you have designed, or a container. It may well run with little modifications with the right pieces, but the environment around each of these different things have to be the same. This is an aspect closer to healthcare, which is rare disease mutation matching. This is not really a topic for this talk, but just to mention, this is this matchmaker exchange, which it's not even fantasy. This has been running for the last 5 years and has generated many, many discoveries by using this protocol. It's a bit clunky, but it does work. The other aspect of GA4GH, which Bartha, the next speaker, I'm sure will touch on, is the framework in which we cast responsible data sharing and data access. And Bartha's great insight was to root this in these 2 human rights, part of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, the right to science and the right to recognition. The great thing about starting there is a very positive statement about science. The other really useful thing in a global context is nearly every country has signed up to these rights. So in some sense, Bartha's view is that we are activating these rights inside of the different countries to ensure that everybody has a right to science and a right to recognition. GA4GH is properly global. The dark blue colors here are the countries that we have direct driver projects in who help drive our standards. Some of them are healthcare systems, like the Swiss Personalized Health Network, or Genomics England, or Australian Genomics. Some of them are research projects, such as TopMed, All of Us, or these international projects like ICDAbio. We have national projects such as GEM Japan, which bring people from across Japan to deliver internally inside of Japan, but also drive standards internationally. So just in summary, the results of ICDA is likely to be ultimately about excellent information generated, both the data and the analysis generated by this federation of consortiums, or whatever the alliance is appropriately described as. But that information being deposited and provided in well-managed databases. There are many people who can run those databases, but I'd point out that both EMBL-EBI and NCBI are 2 places with a long track record of delivering them. And then to achieve some of that analysis and to achieve responsible data access across the world, we need robust, modern software standards, mainly internet protocol based. And GA4GH is the global forum for developing these standards with global buy-in and an internet-like duocracy. So in other words, we are driven by the people who turn up and provide standards. It is as simple as that. If engineers come and set standards, we have a process to help those standards be agreed by multiple engineers and then slowly rolled out across the world. So unsurprisingly, I don't do any work anymore. I just fly around the world giving PowerPoint presentations. And I've talked about EMBL-EBI, which are the people at the top here, and I've talked about GA4GH, which are the people at the bottom. So thank you very much for listening. I hope I've saved you.
So Ewan was a whole 2 minutes under there, so congratulations, Ewan. Those are now your 2 minutes left. Okay, so it's my pleasure to welcome Bartha Knoppers from McGill University for our ethics presentation.
Hello, everyone, at the end of a long 2 days. I'd like to ask you to look behind you to the right to see Michael Parker from the University of Oxford, because we don't have a picture. We were the TBD on the slide this morning, but just so you know, he's a global bioethicist, and both of us are pleased to actually be involved, and you can see a bit of what he's done before he leaves for the airport. So I wanted to make sure that you recognize that you are in good hands. Hmm? So as Ewan mentioned, I want to do something very different and perhaps explain a little bit about what he already started to introduce on how to take a different approach in the next decade, perhaps, towards the larger ethical, social, legal issues surrounding the work that we do, particularly in the data community, though I'm very much aware of the biobanking samples and tissues communities as well. Now, I have three different parts, starting with the same slide that Ewan just showed. So this is 1948. This is a universal declaration. And you note that they actually put it together in the same article. Because people always say, when you say open science, benefit from science, yes, but what about IP? What about being recognized as an author? What about my publications, my tenure, and so on? They actually are part of the same right. And the emphasis that Michael and I would like to put in this particular consortium is on the right to benefit. So we actually see this consortium as moving finally from the mapping the mechanisms to medicine, which means patients. And so it's a real privilege to be involved in this part. Now, as Ewan mentioned, the declaration's a declaration. Over time, it acquires what we call the effect of customary law, but it's better to have your rights in a treaty or a covenant that is signed and ratified by a lot of countries for it to have binding effect. And this is what happened when that Article 27 became Article 15 in 1966 in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Interesting about this is that it becomes legally binding, and there are 169 states that have signed and ratified, which means it becomes part of their internal laws. So everyone in their own country can say to their prime minister, or if you have one, or your premier, or whatever, president, and say, what have you done about my rights, or these rights? And they're legally actionable. And the other good part about human rights is we often get these dualisms between common law, civil law, Western ethics, Asian ethics, and so on, and these sort of tensions about not being sufficiently universal. And the advantage of human rights is that they reach beyond some of these local and legitimate interests, but bring it to the level of humanity. And it belongs to groups, not just individual, autonomy rights, but to groups, collectivities, communities, and so on, and imposes positive duties. This is it still is a Cinderella right. It's a dormant right. It's been 50 years that this right first appeared, and I think it was maybe only 5-6 years ago that started looking at it. And UNESCO itself didn't even look at it till 2009. But look at some of the possible content: access without discrimination, opportunities, freedom, participation, diffusion of science, and so on. Now, a colleague at Cambridge University and I looked at 50 years of the reports that the countries have to report when they sign these covenants or treaties that are binding. What have you done about these rights? We went through all the reports of the last 50 years. And it's going to be published in the European Journal of International Law. It's been a long haul. 76 states report actually incorporating the legislative provisions of the covenant, in particular Article 15, into their internal laws. And most of them in the last 10, 20 years, it's been around data. So sort of the arrival of the internet, and you can see these data access, data use, open science, access to scientific information on an equitable basis appearing in local, when we say local, we mean country by country domestic legislation. And even more interesting is that in a recent article on Citizen Science, there were two authors who also picked up on this right, and they actually say we stand at the crossroads of two developments: growing citizen participation in science and a renewed interest in the unexplored potential of the human right to science. So now you can see that this is also activating, as Ewan said, it catalyzes other rights and participation. So what does this mean for data sharing? Well, we saw the GA4GH mission, and the part that I have a little bit of expertise on is how do we responsibly share data and make sure that we share it internationally so that we get genomic data together with health-related data, health writ large, into patient care. And that's the same slide as Ewan. So what did we do? We started with a framework. We built this framework. It's available in 13 languages, all validated to make sure that the should, must, could, may, and so on fits across the 13 languages. And there are policies for a large part of the attributes of the framework. These policies were written in 2014-15. They were just revised. We have new privacy security because of the GDPR. We have revised consents because of genomic medicine and needing to do research with patients, with their patient records when they come in, keeping the genomic information integrated, putting it out to research, and then bringing it back to the patient. So you'll see some interesting new changes coming at the next meeting of GA4GH in a month or so. The only one that hasn't been picked up on yet, you can imagine, is the last one there, the one on ethics review recognition. How do you get a system of ethics review where there's a lead researcher to accept that if Japan meets the following conditions for ethics review, everybody else will follow and say, good, one review. Can you imagine? One ethics review. Because in consortia, where you want to bring different entities together, this is a major, major roadblock. I once had the project, well, some of you will know, in Cartagena, 3-year, had to spend money before March 31st or the feds would claw it back, and it took 18 months to do ethics review. I did 15 ethics committees. So what is this language of sharing across borders when medical data in particular, as Ewan showed, is even more closed in? Clinical data is highly confidential. So the OECD picked up on the challenge, on the governance, and started looking at the possibility of introducing language where sharing health data would serve the public interest. So we can start seeing, we heard a lot of language yesterday about common frameworks, the commons, common good, serve the public interest, subject to safeguards. And look exactly what GA4GH is trying to do, facilitate the compatibility, interoperability of health data governance frameworks. The AAAS is working on this. They did survey across all of their scientists, from physicists to anthropologists and so on, and asked, what does this mean? What should the governments do to activate the right to science? And of course, the first was give us more money. What else? We all need to have our funding for our research. But you can see number 4, ensure, and this is not a hierarchy, okay? It was just the top 5, but with no order. Ensure open access to scientific information. There was only one court case so far that I've been able to find in the world that used the right to benefit from science, and this was in Costa Rica, where IVF was banned. And so an infertile couple decided to go to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and say, it's our right to have this treatment. 15% of the female population in most countries are infertile. And so it was considered to be discriminatory and the right to found a family, the right of reproductive autonomy, extends to the right to benefit from scientific progress and its application. So there we have it. Now this is my favorite slide. This is a cartographer in Montreal. This is collaboration between scientists in 2005 to 2009. Now you can see Canada's missing. We're a little bit at the top, and most of it's snow, so you don't see Canada there at all, but we are there a little bit, United States, Europe, and so on. But where's everyone else? But then look at this, in 2014. So scientists are already sharing and collaborating. It's not something governments have to force or funders have to force them to do. This is proof that this is how science works as a humanistic and socioeconomic endeavor. We heard all day yesterday about the missing diversity, and I think that's really important in Canada. Particularly, we're an immigrant country. There are many, many, many ethnicities. There are many, we have indigenous peoples, and where are they in our population studies? So my last part then, if this language of common good and common frameworks and so on, how do we build it? Well, the UN Special Rapporteur 5 years ago said, let's start thinking about science or as a public good approach to knowledge and innovation, and guard against the privatization of knowledge that deprives individuals and of opportunities to take part and enjoy the fruits of scientific progress. So that's public good language. 2 years ago, UNESCO, recognizing that science is a common good, hence the open communication of results as suggested by the phrase of academic freedom, because it is a freedom to be able to express your results. Talked about the sharing of scientific data, and again mentioned Article 25, Article 15 of the Covenant as the international foundations. And I think I heard foundational resources yesterday when we started. So just to demystify, how do we do this when the GDPR came out? I knew GDPR was going to come up. Well, what the GA4GH has done, it's built a primer. It asked for volunteers amongst the regulatory ethics work stream, especially the legal beagles. Could anybody explain in ordinary English what can or cannot be done? What do we do about the cloud? What does anonymization mean? Does it have anything to do with the rest of the world? Isn't it only Europe? And so you'll find little 400-word capsules in ordinary English every month have been coming out for the last year, and you can send in your questions and they will find 2 experts and answer in a short, comprehensible way. Similarly, the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe has started coming out with recommendations about health-related data. So we're moving a little bit beyond the genomic, getting into the medical, into genomic medicine. There's another report coming on what the right to benefit means in about 3-4 months, and this report is called a general comment, and it has interpretive value, which means judges, ministries of health, funders, and so on will be using it. And finally, here's some more data, again from the GA4GH. We're going to be drowning in data. But yesterday I heard we need even more data. And so to do that, we're going to have to learn how to activate this right to make sure our governments allow us to do that. So there you have it. All the locks, in theory, of data hoarding, data hiding, data ownership, and so on, will, a private ownership will hopefully be rent asunder, as we say. And what struck me particularly, I had the slide before we saw the cohort session yesterday, is that from the journal's point of view, this is Nature Genetics, a public sharing of genetic and family history, public sharing of genetic and family history information, including full personal genomic, is a public good transmitting knowledge of benefit to the whole human population. It goes beyond genetic goals, beyond our understanding of evolution and disease susceptibilities. The more we know of our common origins, histories of admixture, global population movements, The more we help one another to absorb our commonality and differences, these goals are outside genetics, in anthropology, in history, and in society. So again, a slide from the GA4GH. This is incredible. If this is true, and I think it is true, otherwise we can tell Ewan, if we can create such a virtual cohort and do the stratification to get down to the precision medicine, and then in a learning feedback loop in learning health systems, then we can really inform clinical care. So this is when Eric Lander called me and I said, uh-oh. And I said, well, Eric, I'm kind of tired. And he said, well, you know, we're getting to medicine. We're finally going to get to medicine. And I said, yes, that's what this is. This is the final frontier. And I think that's where we are. So get back to the shared genome, the heritage of humanity. What can we do here? And I'm going to end with this. I think the novelty of this human rights approach is to reorient our conversation from policing science to governing society, and shift our focus from avoiding risks to protecting opportunities. Now, we're in the Benjamin Franklin. That's the other Franklin. I'm sure you know who this one is, Eleanor Franklin. So what do? We're a platform apparently here in ICDA. Michael Parker and myself would like to know, we are principled, we are pragmatic, and we're practical. So you might have the most practical issue or the most principled or whatever, you know, bring it on, is all I have to say. We're going to develop this platform. It's not going to be just Michael and myself. For now, send all your questions, comments, vision, issues, queries to Rachel. Rachel, where are you? Is she here? Oh. Anyway, send it, there she is, send it to Rachel for now till we get organized and coordinated, and then she will send them on. We're interested in the day-to-day conduct of science, even while we're working on this higher principled approach. There might be issues that you think are local, but the more personal and local, you'd be surprised, usually the more universal they are. So that's the end of our presentation. And I want to thank ICDA for this opportunity. Thank you.
So thank you to Bartha. We'll hold over any questions until the end. And we now have our final speaker. So if I look slightly concerned at this point, it's because I've seen David's presentation and I know how many slides there are. I'm going to say it again, any means necessary. Okay. So welcome to David from Barrier Life Sciences, who will talk about data platforms. Thank you.
Now I just have to find my slides and then we'll be all set. You assured me they were in a tab. I don't see the tab, so maybe this one. There we go. Found it. Excellent. All right, so I'm not sure why Helen was worried about my ability to fit 58 slides into 15 minutes, so we'll see how it goes. What's that? Just unplug and replug? Yep, there we go.
Use the mic.
Yes, I will do that. All right, I think we are, I used 34 seconds getting started. You can decide whether to count that against me. All right, so data platforms. Helen and I are chairing the Data Platforms Working Group, and what I wanted to do in this last session is talk about what do we think we should do and can do to support all of the things that we've heard about. And the yellow highlight there really summarizes how we see the role of data platforms in the ICDA. The mission is straight out of the white paper. The job of data platforms is to use tech to help that mission be accomplished. I'm going to talk about the purposes of a data platform briefly, talk about some of the principles that we think need to apply to any data platforms built and used in the ICDA, and then give some updates on some of the progress towards this that I and others in this room have been involved with in building data platforms that are moving in the direction of the needs that we are seeing for ICDA related projects. We heard a couple of quotes yesterday. Rory talked about how we really wanted to increase the number and type. You didn't use the word, but democratizing access to data, democratizing research, that the notion of making our data, this is something data platforms should help with. They should help take the data that we all generate, collect, and make available, and make it more useful and more available to more people. Francis Collins yesterday talked about the example of how it would be nice to collapse 3 years of work by an international team into something a grad student could do in a couple of weeks of work. Data platforms can help with that. Can't solve it all, but they can certainly remove a lot of the friction. And then Eric yesterday really summarized all of this into one very, very simple statement and said, give me ways to pry it open. I want access to it. And that's what data platforms do. If you forgive a slight digression here, you might be wondering where I'm going with this slide. And you can tell that I did not have a classical education, because my introduction to Socrates came through a book written by an IBM software engineer in the 1970s. But for those of you, how many of you know the book, The Mythical Man Month? Okay, dozen hands in the room. It's one of the classics of early software engineering, where software engineering started to be a thing you could call engineering. And one of the early articulate observers was what was going on in the field. He wrote a book in 1975. He then, a decade after that book, wrote an essay reflecting on some of the things that hadn't happened in the field of software engineering. And in his reflection, he referred back to the way Socrates talked about there are accidental and essential elements of the world, properties of the world. And in the field of software engineering, and I would argue in the field of biomedical research or genomics research, there are essential hard problems. There are things that we are trying to understand. There's combining ideas, there's reasoning about the world, there's designing experiments. That's the hard work that's the essence of the craft. And then there's the crap you do on top that gets in your way of actually getting at the real thing. In the early days of software engineering, accidental was making sure your deck of punch cards was properly sorted. In the middle days, it was making sure that when you had a typo, when you had a comma instead of a semicolon, you could find it. That's kind of the accidental crap that we can and should automate and get out of the way. And I think we still have a lot of accidental crap that we can and should automate and get out of the way of biomedical research, leaving an awful lot of essential hard work. Data platform's job is strip it down to the essential, use the crowbar to pry off everything but the essential, so that those of you who don't want to think about the accidental don't have to and can get on with the work. So that's the purpose. That's what we're trying to do. Some principles. This is the principle you heard talked about a lot yesterday. When I first started my path towards being semi-bilingual and learning a little bit about the world of biomedical research 5 or 6 years ago, this was a novel and controversial idea. It no longer is. This is now pretty clearly either, depending on who you talk to, the present or the near future, or likely a part of the future. This is now accepted as an important part of how the world is going to do biomedical research, and for a set of important reasons at the bottom. When you bring researchers to data, you end up with an inherently more secure environment. You can screw it up, you can get it right either way, but it's easier to get it right when you have to secure one environment instead of every copy. An inherently lower cost environment instead of having multiple copies of the same infrastructure. An inherently more accessible environment because you don't need, as each researcher, to have their own IT department and data center in order to do large scale. And I think most importantly, you end up with an environment that facilitates collaboration. It kind of suggests let's work together. You still get to decide, but it encourages it. Some of the other principles, few of us, several in this room, put together this notion of the data biosphere and laid out these red principles at the bottom right that are some of the attributes that we think are important in building data platforms that have applied over the last couple of years and will apply in the ICDA. And it's really all centered around this needs to be and these same words occur in the ICDA white paper around the science. It needs to be a modular community ecosystem kind of effort as opposed to a closed monolithic central kind of effort. That applies to the science, it applies to the data platforms. One of the ways you enable that is you use standards, so that if person A builds a module that wants to talk to person B, as long as they're speaking the same language, technical language between them, it works. Ewan talked about that. That is exactly what the Global Alliance does. And as I and others work on data platforms, we work very closely with the Global Alliance. Global Alliance doesn't do implementations. We try not to do standards. It works well together. So there's some principles. Now what I'd like to do is give you an update on some of the progress that some of the teams that I've been working with have been making towards implementing those principles, putting them to work in practice, and some high level and then a couple of examples. Other people are implementing these same principles. The whole point of modular and open is they can. I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that I and the people I'm collaborating with are working on. This code living in open source in GitHub under github.com/databiosphere. It's like most under development projects. It's messy, it's in progress, but it's being done in the open. And what the Broad Institute, the team with Anthony Philippakis at the Broad Institute and the team at Verily and some others have been working on is a platform that we call Terra to work on enabling biomedical research in accordance with all the principles and modularity that we talked about a minute ago. Terra, you can see it at terra.bio. It's not really open for wide business, but it's open, it's available, it's out there. People are welcome to look at it. One of the interesting things that we found in developing Terra is we had to think about who are we building it for? And we settled on these three user communities, these three personas at the outsides of this picture. And they're all represented in this room. Many of you wear more than one of these hats. But at the bottom left, you have the group of people who are data generators. And there's a set of needs that as data generators people have around managing their data and making their data available under the terms that they want to make it available and controlling their data. And at the bottom right, you have tool developers who are developing new methods. We heard a lot of awesome new tools here. We heard the panel before with Hillary and Anshul and others. We're talking about some of the new methods that are coming on. How can we make sure that as new methods are developed, they are as available as they should be so more people can use them? And at the top, you have biomedical researchers who want to build on all of the tools and methods and data sets that have been developed. What the Terra platform does is provides both a platform and then various front ends to expose that to different people. These are some of the data sets that people are currently working with inside Terra. And what I wanted to do in the last 6 minutes is do two quick demos. And these are going to be screenshot demos, but I'm going to walk through. Francis yesterday talked about how with the All of Us research program, as all the different groups have been for the last couple of years, enrolling people, collecting data, collecting biosamples, and assembling that all into the Data and Research Center, we're now building a researcher workbench, which will be launching in alpha later this year. And the goals of the All of Us Researcher Workbench, which is built on the technology stack I showed you before, from a participant point of view, were to be a reliable way to store data that's widely available and safe from inappropriate use, while at the same time giving researchers a powerful and collaborative environment to work and a way where they can stand on each other's shoulders, where they can reproduce the results that each other have done. So here's a quick proof of concept analysis done in the All of Us Researcher Workbench. You go into the front end, you say you want to create a workspace. Workspace is a unit of collaboration, of sharing, of who do you want to see it. Describe what your workspace is. First thing I wanted to do in this analysis is create a new cohort. I create a cohort and I'm mining the EHR data, so I go through and pick out some conditions of interest, pick some diabetes conditions, get a snapshot of what my cohort is looking like as I'm building it, build some more things, add this in. Oh, and I say also I'm only interested in people where there's a lab result for A1C that's available, and I've now built a cohort of 40,000 individuals from the data set who have a diagnosis of diabetes and have an A1C result on file. So I save that. I'm now going to build a control cohort. So I'm going to build another cohort where I go through a very similar process, but this time there's an exclude, a not in the middle, and I've now built a criteria of people, a cohort of people who don't have a diagnosis of diabetes, but do have an A1C on file. So I've now built two cohorts, done this all with really just a few clicks and pointing around and getting a sense of my data as I'm doing it. I now go in and I can create a notebook. Notebooks, for those of you who don't know, are a way to package up analysis code in Python or R or other analysis languages, package it up for reproducibility, for sharing, and for modularity of use. Once I built this notebook, and you can typically build one of these by copying and pasting from someone who's done a similar analysis. In this case, it's a simple analysis. Import the data from the 2 cohorts we've built, use some canned visualization software, and say, please show me the distribution of A1C values in my 2 cohorts. You run the notebook, and you see what you'd expect to see, which is higher A1C in the people in the population who were had a diagnosis of diabetes and not. Nothing scientifically interesting here, but it's an example of how you can work with concepts of cohorts and analysis tools and mix and match. And now if someone else wanted to do a slightly different analysis, you share this workspace with them, and they could do an analysis of blood pressure on a different condition, or pick whatever you want and then go deeper and deeper. All of us so far does not have genomic data, so I have one other example where I'll show you an analysis we did using the same platform, using some of the UK Biobank data. This was actually an analysis where what we did is we set out to reproduce a paper that Sek Katerysin's lab had published. And it was a GWAS analysis of albuminuria and cardiac disease, went into Terra, went to the data library, picked the UK Biobank. There's a data browser for UK Biobank with different data instead of the cohort builder that used EHR terms. This is a phenotype explorer, and this is interactive where you can pick and click and pick the cohort that you're interested in analyzing. We had a workspace built in the center of the page that did the UK Biobank analysis. And then this walked through how to do it. Included in that were the notebooks that had the actual sharp end of the stick that ran the analysis. This particular notebook is the one that used Hale to run the GWAS after having defined a phenotype and built the 2 different cohorts, and then do the visualization, generate the Manhattan plot, and then of course right-click, save as figure 1, and then you're off and running and doing what you would want with this. So what I just showed you are how we can, given the principles that we think are important to allow a community of people to really move forward, in the environment that we're in, where as data is exploding and exploding globally and the tools are exploding, what are the needs, what are the crowbars that we need, and what might that look like, and some early progress on building data platforms that conform to those principles and move forward. Helen and I I'm not going to go through this slide in any detail at all, this is the last slide. Helen and I have talked about what should the data platforms working group focus on. This is our initial to-do list of things that we will prioritize and sort through and go deeper on a few of these and save many of these as a for later. I think the one thing I do want to highlight on this slide, there's a few basics at the beginning, the basics, the principles. We know our data platforms work for the ICDA to support ICDA, has to do all this and will. And then we're going to prioritize everything else by collecting the scientific use cases from the different working groups, from this larger community, and saying, what doors do you want pried open? And those are going to be the tools that we prioritize building. The list here are the things that we've heard, that we suspect, that we know are going to be things that are important. The order and the depth in which we attack them is going to come from all of you. So with that, I feel like I should fill the last 10 seconds just because I wouldn't want to finish early. And I think in 3 more seconds, I'll be able to say, thank you very much.
Beautifully done. Thank you, David. We are 15 minutes into the general discussion time, so I'm looking.
People 5 minutes.
5 minutes?
Discussion.
Wonderful.
So 5, 6 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Is Bartha? Perfect, she's there. I see her. Thank you. Okay, so we can take a couple of questions from the floor then for 5 minutes.
Yeah. It's very interesting, isn't it?
Hi.
Nadine?
So I happen to sit at the perfect Venn diagram of public hatred right now with my interest in health data and working for a pharmaceutical company. And I can understand the level of distrust that generates when I say I'm interested in accessing health data for the purposes of making medicines. Part of that distrust is not well-founded, but part of it might extend from a lack of understanding of what initiatives like this will try and do. Part of it might be well-based. I wonder if the ICDA has a real opportunity to get ahead of that and reassure, first of all, try to understand what are people's concerns when it comes to the sharing of data for the purposes of medicines creation. And then second, how can we educate or communicate what it is that we're trying to do so people don't have those concerns, or if they do, we understand why they have those concerns.
Okay. You?
Yeah, I think a very interesting piece of information here was quite a comprehensive survey done by the Wellcome Trust 4 years ago, where they looked in the UK context at public perception of these different things. And the public made a very big difference between, the UK public made a very big difference between commercial companies involved in drug research, which ultimately benefits patients, which they were comfortable with, but wanted to see reassurance that nothing untoward was going to happen, compared to commercial companies that weren't going to have a patient benefit. And they put the second lot in a completely different category. Now, I think that work is being extended by Anna Middleton and others in a broader way. I'm not quite sure if that question is there, but I think that's the sort of work that we need to do across many, many different countries to understand first what is going on in terms of people's perception, and then one can go through a process again, which tends to be country specific, about addressing the things that we don't think is right. As it happens, I think the UK public here is kind of in a reasonable zone that researchers can work with.
Yeah, I just wonder if a specific action item the ICDA could take would be to initiate public education schemes or other things around how health data are being used for medicines discovery.
This is for ICDA to think through, but my advice here is to think, ICDA is not the only grouping of people trying to do this. So there is a business there about being part of a broad coalition that's trying to address that. I don't know if Bartha wants to add.
Well, no. I think what I want to address is the first part of your question, which is, I read some disturbing news yesterday that Canadians are 44% think scientists are elitist. And this could have in part to do with the anti-science, anti-vax, anti-climate, they don't even believe in climate change, et cetera. So how do we, I think the more we can show that we're collaborating beyond our own careers, our own area of interest, our own disease, our own communities, if we can show we're collaborating internationally, that might help to get more trust, and I think we'll get even more trust and participation, engagement, as you said, when we start to bring that into medicine. They think we're in this rare gene somewhere or mutation, who knows what not, and when they can start to see that it involves them not just in research protocols but in everyday medicine, that all the last 40, 50 years are actually coming into the clinic, we might regain some of that trust.
So I don't want to cut in, but I just want to add to that over here.
Oh, thank you.
I'm Amy Lassie at night again, and I just want to reiterate the comment I made this morning, and that's involving people in the beginning of the project and incorporating patients and other stakeholders right away, and not bringing them in at the end and informing them what's going to happen, but actually bringing them as equal partners into the project.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Please.
I wanted to touch on a contrast in the last two talks, one on democratization and the rights of all peoples to benefit.
Get closer to the mic, please.
Okay, well, I wanted to contrast the last two talks where we talked about the right of all peoples to benefit and have access, and the Terra presentation where you very quickly skipped through the little thing that said, funding source on your Terra platform. And I'm wondering, how are you going to deal with somebody, if you go back and look at the slides, there's National Institutes of Health account, right? So there's an account information. I'm wondering if you're a clinic in Nairobi, how are you going to pay for access to these kinds of resources?
So making sure I understand the question. Is the question about cost,
who
dollar
pays?
signs?
Yeah, who pays for this?
I see. So it depends is the short answer. And in the case of all of us, the model is that the NIH has decided is the NIH is providing credits for a certain level of usage, and then beyond that, the researchers pay for the resources that they consume. And it's a pure pay for the cost of the electricity, the storage and compute that they're using. So it's roughly the same model as the traditional, which is if you want to download data onto your disks and use your computers to analyze it, you pay for your disks and your computers and your air conditioning and et cetera. And in the cloud, the model that the All of Us team program has chosen is the same, is you pay for the disks and computers that you're using at cost.
Yeah, that's what I figure, and that's why I'm contrasting it with the notion of the right of all peoples to benefit from the data. And I'm just wondering what the model's going to be for a resource-poor country or clinic to access.
I think there's an important underlying question there, which exists today.
Yeah.
So how do the researchers in, for example, Nairobi get access to UK Biobank to do interesting work? And in the moment, it's quite difficult for them to do so. So by changing the way this works, where the researcher works more remotely, opens up some options that previously weren't on the table. And one of those options here is to waive fees for certain classes of researchers. So this would be an option that has to be thought through. I do think this kind of flexible cloud computing gives us more options, not less. But let me talk about a different concern from many of my European colleagues. They are sort of overly paranoid sometimes about US tech companies. And so it's also important that all of this software can run on a effectively purely French cloud, or purely British cloud, or what have you. And that requirement, which is a different requirement, is as important as that cost requirement. So we have more flexibility, not less, in this future world.
Yeah. Thank you. And I just add words I sometimes use. I like the framing. Is there's cost and there's price, and what the technology can do is lower the cost, and then you still have your price choices about who pays for what.
Okay. So if there are no further questions, we will thank our speakers again and move to the general discussion. Thank you.